Okay, hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nadia Yohannisova from the Department of Environmental Studies here at the faculty, and today it is my pleasure to welcome and to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Clive Spash. Clive is an economist, an ecological economist, and for the last 15 years or so, he has been a chair of the Department of Public Policy and Governance at the Vienna University of Business and Economics. He has on and off also been very active, president, vice president of the European Society of Ecological Economics. And he is actually ranked one of the top 5% of economists in terms of his citation index and publications. One of his latest book, The Foundations of Social Ecological Economics, I think is a very important book in the field. I have it here if anybody will want to look at it after the lecture. And we have asked Clive to explain especially about what is ecological economics, how it differs from mainstream economics, which you find in the mainstream textbooks of economics, and actually even mention the difference between environmental economics and ecological economics. So I'm very glad he has accepted our invitation. I'm looking forward very much to his presentation, which is actually being recorded. And I'm hoping that after the presentation, there will be many questions because, as always, the discussion is always the most important and interesting part of the lecture. So I think I've said everything, so it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to be here. And like Nadia says, I'm going to run through a kind of introduction to ecological economics, but by contrasting with mainstream economics. So I'll look at, actually, to start with, a little bit of history of thought, going back to occurrences of environmental thinking in economics, going back to the 1800s. Then I'll look at what is environmental economics and how it arose. And I call it the revolution that was never was, because it didn't fundamentally change the way economics is operating. Then I'll look at the realist agenda in ecological economics. What do we mean by realism? And then I'll contrast the environmental and ecological economics positions to clarify before drawing some conclusions. Okay, so let's go back and think about the development of environmental thinking in economics. How is the environment discussed in economics? If we go back and look at the role of nature in terms of the way that economists have looked at it, we can go back to the classical economists, so people like Adam Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, and their discussions of nature. Nature is discussed as land, so it's reduced down to a single kind of entity. Land is an input to production. They're living in basically agricultural economies, agricultural economics systems, so their concern is about food production. But they also recognize the need for labor, but you can't just increase labor because you get into problems of population growth. So the problem that they see is population growing, outstripping the food production supply, and therefore you get collapse. So the economic system is always subject to collapse and that there are limits. And this is the kind of Malthusian, it's usually called Malthusian problem of classical economics. By the time you get to the mid to late 1800s, you start to get much more of an industrialized economy and economic system, and you start to run into other issues. So that nature starts expanding into other kind of issues. John Stuart Mill is discussing the stationary state, so he regards the natural state of an economic system as being stable, not growth, not growing. And he also mentions conflicts between economic growth and nature and naturalness along the way. Stanley Jevons, who's basically a founder of neoclassical economics and was an engineer by training, it raises the issue of the coal question. So the United Kingdom has industrialized, it's heavily dependent on coal. What happens when coal runs out? Then you have a limit to the growth to the system, and the system can collapse. He also raises the interesting issue of the paradox, something called the Jevon paradox, that increasing efficiency does not reduce consumption, but actually leads to more consumption. And then we have Alfred Marshall, who writes the first real economics textbook in the late 1800s, goes through many editions, like 11 editions or so in his lifetime, So it really sets up what modern neoclassical economics is in a way. And he's discussing the free gifts of nature. So we still see land as a key input, but also he introduces ideas of human knowledge now coming in terms of producing utilities. So what we have then, in summary here, from this kind of classical to neoclassical period, is that nature is seen as both as a means to and a limit on the production of wealth and utilities. So it performs both roles. And if we look at Marshall, how Marshall is discussing nature and the human condition, Marshall's Principles of Economics discusses it in this way. He says, man cannot create material things. In the mental and moral world, indeed, he may only produce new ideas, but when he is said to produce material things, he only produces utilities. The agents of production are commonly classed as land, labor, and capital. So we have these three things, which still exist today, right, in mainstream economic thinking. Land is meant the material and forces by which nature gives freely for man's aid. So nature is providing things for free in this kind of approach. So land, water, air, light, heat, and so on. Capital consists in great part of knowledge and organization. So capital is not physical, it's not financial, it's actually knowledge. And it enables us to subdue nature and force her to satisfy our wants. So implicit in this whole approach is the subjugation of nature, that man will be superior to nature and control it. And there's only two agents of production, really, nature and man. So this is the kind of approach we have. But also, interestingly, Marshall says, the use of a certain area of the Earth's surface is a primary condition of anything that man can do. As yet, insufficient prominence has been given to it. It is the foundation of much that is most interesting and most difficult in economic science. What he's saying there is that basically taking account of nature, the nature of the reality of our economic systems, requires us to look at the underlying environment and nature of resources. What is the earth? What are the limits? And this is what economics has failed to do. And he's recognizing that even at his time. So what about Marx? When we get to Marx, who's also writing around the late 1800s about the evolution of the economic system, he also discusses nature quite a lot. So what he says is the bodies of commodities are the combination of two elements, matter and labor. If we take away useful labor expended upon them, a material substratum is always left, which is furnished by nature without the help of man. In this work of changing the form, he is consistently helped by natural forces. So when you create production systems, means of production, you're always going to have to look at the natural forces. When we see then that labor is not the only source of material wealth. So the use values produced by labor actually require that we take into account natural systems, natural structures. As William Petty puts it, labor is the father and earth its mother. Now, what this may appear confusing for anybody who knows Marx's theory, because Marx actually then goes on to explore a labor theory of value as the key to understanding how capitalism operates. But what he's saying here is that material wealth is actually dependent not just on labor, but actually also on the earth. Now, if we go back to William Petty, actually Marx is slightly misquoting him. So William Petty's original quote is, labor is the father and active principle of wealth, as lands are the mother. And this is written in 1662, right? So we deal again with an agricultural society with obvious dependency between these two factors. However, Marx, as I said, subordinates things spontaneously provided by nature. So he regards again that things that come from nature are basically free, that they actually don't add value to the production process. Only labor adds production value. So what he calls exchange value is dependent on the labor theory of value. So natural forces provide gratuitous services such as water, steam, air, and electricity. And this is a critical aspect that we can say in Marx. He's recognizing the role of nature, just like Marshall did, but then they're not taking it into account seriously in the way that value is created. So his economics then solely focuses on commodities for market exchange, and his labor theory of value only attributes value in exchange to labor. There's no value added by the non-human input to production. So this is despite his recognizing all sorts of issues, which he does in Capital Volume 1, for example. Agriculture depends on soil fertility. He repeatedly mentions this, and he talks about things like greedy farmers destroying soil fertility. Well, if you destroy soil fertility, you don't get any production from the agricultural system. So there's a problem there in terms of this theory. But there's a whole range of other people discussing the relationship of economic systems to nature in the 1800s and the 1900s, and they are non-economists. So there's a whole range of non-economists, chemists, physicists, people who understand energy flows and material flows through a system. So we can look at a whole range of people who are basically writing about the social energetics of the system, the energy flows, the energy values. How does an agricultural system work? So the Narodnik movement, the peasant movement in Russia, recognizing social energetics, people who are leading physicists of the day, identifying the real nature of the economy as opposed to the money, debt, wealth economy, so that it's underlying the economy is actually a physical reality that needs to be taken into account, energetics, evolution, and so on. And a whole range of then results of this, when we get to people who are crossing over into the economics and the planning area, like Otto Neurath or Joseph Popolinkus, they're talking about how you can design an economy. How should an economy be planned? Because all economies are planned. Every single economy is a planned system and of different types. So how do you plan that system so that you take into account the social flows of material and energy through the system? Because you cannot ignore it, otherwise systems will collapse. Okay, so then we get to the neoclassical economics, environmental economics. What is environmental economics? As I say, made in the USA, right? What we see is that when you get to the early 1900s, you have a discussion about how resources should be used. So there is a conflict, a value conflict, between people discussing nature in the US and wise use utilitarianism. So the forest sector, for example, setting up national parks are confronted by people who want to exploit forests, who want to cut them down and use them for timber. This is utilitarianism. So there's a conflict between positions here, between valuing nature in one way and valuing them in a different way, and while they just things that are going to be for production. So interestingly, you then start to get things like the Journal of Land and Public Utility Economics set up in 1925, and very early on you've got this Aldo Leopold, who's writing on wilderness, is publishing in this journal, which is then becoming a journal that is supporting very much a utilitarian approach. And what happens when you get to the 1930s is the Dust Bowl is a massive realization of a failure of the economic system. Exploitation of soil, just like Marx was talking about, denuding the soil, taking the nutrients out, failing to take into account the structure of ecosystems, and what results is devastation. The topsoil blows away, people are made homeless, and they have to migrate because the systems have collapsed around them. So the Dust Bowl of the 1930s is a major realization that economic systems cannot just operate on the basis of these simplistic models of land, labor, and capital, and you have to take into account ecosystems. So you have to change public policy to start taking this into account. So by the 1950s, we get discussions of resources, the types of resources there are, but this is a minority pursuit. So Serasi Wantrup is an outlier when he writes his book on resource conservation and tries to point out that actually the environment is distinct from other types of inputs and has to be taken into account in a different way. But of course, then we get this thing with the non-renewable resources arising, concerns about what happens if resources run out, which is back to the same issue that Jevons was raising. So we get people like Gray and Hotelling discussing that these types of resources are distinct. Non-renewable resources, oil, coal, and so on, are distinct from other types of resources that go into an economic system and have to be taken into account. Second World War, post-Second World War, Second World War makes them realize that supply chains are extremely important. How do you secure your supply chains? So Resources for the Future was set up on the basis of an investigation by the government at the time with the Paley Commission looking at how we have resources for freedom. Could have been written yesterday, right? Resources for freedom. How do we secure our resources against the other powers, the geopolitics of resource supply? So renewable resources becoming a very key issue, non-renewable resources. Okay, environmental economics then arises only in the 1960s and 1970s. So you have this concern for degradation, soil degradation, forestry, agriculture. Then you get concern for non-renewable resources and securing their supply. And the pollution problems that are the other side of this only start coming out in the 60s and 70s. By then, you get concerns about how do we take into account the pollution. So how do we value the pollution? Can we make it part of the economic system so it's taken into account? And you start getting concerns about doing cost-benefit analysis. Can I estimate the value of the pollution, the harm that is done, and put it into the system? Okay, so what we have then to summarize is that if you go look at what happens with the way that economic thought is interacting with concerns about the environment, you move from the classical to the neoclassical economics. In terms of the general theories, agriculture and forestry economics comes along chronologically, then resource economics, and then environmental economics. And this is a flow, but they're built on these kind of consistent ideas: land, labor, capital, free gifts of nature, these kinds of concepts, limited understandings. So environmental economics. What is environmental economics? So I call it the revolution that never was, because what you have is a growing concern in the 60s to the 1980s about the environmental pollution problems of the industrialized, developed world, and what's it doing. So what you get is a whole range of pollution problems that become literally, people are aware of these. DDT bioaccumulation, so DDT getting into the food chain, threatening the species at the top of the food chain with genetic deformities and preventing reproduction. And of course, who's at the top of the food chain? That's us, right? So radioactive fallout from nuclear testing by the United States, by France, in the open air, ending up getting into mother's milk in North America. So when they realize that this is strontium-90 is now in mother's milk in North America, people start getting shocked about it. We get the price rise control, when you get the price rise, which is due to oligopoly, not due to the lack of supply in terms of it running out, it is actually a shock to the system that actually what happens if the resources are cut? What happens when the gas stops flowing, the oil stops flowing, the energy supplies are restricted? But also the other side of this is the pollution, right? Coming out the other side, long-range transport of air pollutants is actually contested originally, but it's there. Acid rain, which is acidic deposition, destroying forests. The British burning coal on their island, exporting this coal, the pollutant, to Scandinavia and Germany and destroying forests and lakes and so on. So people starting to become aware of this. Climate change originally seen as an issue concern around this time period as being due to supersonic aircraft, things like Concorde, creating supersonic jets that fly into the upper atmosphere and then destroy the upper atmosphere and change its chemistry. Also things like Love Canal, like dumping large amounts of toxic chemicals and waste from innovative industrial processes into landfills and then building housing estates and schools on top of them, resulting in 56% birth defects amongst the people who are living their children and the mothers who are having children. This is the United States, right? Stratospheric ozone depletion, people develop brand new chemicals for spraying your armpits. And what does it do? It ends up destroying the upper atmosphere. Uncertain consequences, ignorance about what you're doing when you innovate with chemicals and you start pushing new substances into open systems which you don't understand. Nuclear reactor accidents, radioactive waste, and so on, right? So we've got 3 Mile Island, Sellafield in the UK, pollutants coming out of them, the meltdown at Chernobyl. So what we have is then arising a distinct concern that environmental harm caused by development, innovation, and technology. Development, innovation, and technology, all these things inherently good, aren't they, we're told? But actually, no, not inherently good, creating all sorts of damages, harms, and problems for us. Negative qualities of growth economies, not taken into account and ignored. So what we have then is environmental economics comes along, trying to take these things into account. And this is then seen as a potential revolutionary change in economic thought. So what you have is mainstream economists writing books on economics and the environment and saying this is a profession rethinking, extending, and revising its concepts and finding new applications for them. There's a ferment in the profession, just as there was when the Keynesian revolution was in progress. So they regard this as a revolutionary change in economic thought. If we take pollution seriously, if we take these things into account, if we take the environment into account seriously, then the economics profession will have to change the way it conceptualizes and thinks. And they start raising a whole range of topics. So we have things like spaceship Earth, which is contrast to the ordinary economy being like a cowboy economy. You exploit resources and ride off to the next place after you've destroyed the environment. Values beyond use, so that not just the utilitarian values, but starting to raise things like existence values of non-humans and others. Material balance theory, so taking into account the laws of thermodynamics, which I'll come back to. Entropy, the qualitative analysis of funds and stocks in George Rogan's work, steady state economy coming back in with Herman Daly's work, ethics and the treatment of future generations. A whole range of things coming on board which cannot be taken into account by orthodox mainstream approaches to economics. They misconceptualize and cannot understand them. So let me just take one of these, materials balance theory, okay? What happens with materials balance theory? What is materials balance theory about? It's about inputs and outputs in terms of physical, biological, and chemical processes. So, as we know, but economists too often neglect from their models, physical inputs with specific qualities are required. They create specific desired outcomes, but also result in undesirable outputs. So this is the basic throughput of an economy, right? It's just like a biological entity. To sustain it, you have to have inputs, and you will get outputs. So the law of conservation of mass, basic laws of physics. What goes in must come out in equal mass. So this is taken into account in the early 1970s, the book in 1970 coming out of Resources for the Future, which is this mainstream economic think tank, trying to take into account exactly that, remodel the economy. And what does it tell you? It tells you about all these flows that are going around, waste products coming out of the system on a very large scale, because they have to be on a large scale, because the more growth you have, the more material throughput you have, the same mass is going to come out the other end. So, what happens to this kind of thinking? So Inga Rutger is an ecological economist, interviewed many of these original thinkers in terms of environmental economics and others. And Keynes was an originator of that materials balance approach and the lead author on that book. He says he was later at a loss to explain what had happened to materials balance theories. He admitted it had achieved no impact on economics and had just disappeared from environmental economic discourse. But he did know nothing about it. So what you get is conformity. What did he do? He conformed to the mainstream neoclassical approaches. And that happened with all of those issues that I raised. Materials balance theory, thermodynamics became general equilibrium framework. Pollution is all pervasive, became an optimal control framework. Plural values outside of economics became value monism and cost-benefit analysis and welfare theory. Ethics of future generations became utilitarianism and the return on investment for growth and discounting. Every single one of those conceptual ideas, which was a major challenge to mainstream orthodoxy, was made into something that conformed to the orthodoxy. So what we have here is dogmatism, paradigmatic conformity outweighing empirical evidence. The realist conceptualization and scientific investigation of the object of study is pushed out. This is unscientific. This is not good science. So, what would be the economics approach? Then we would have a realist agenda, taking reality into account. So economies are open systems. One of the first things we can realize is that the economic system is dependent upon the exchange of materials and energy with their surroundings. This is well recognized going back into the 1800s with all those authors I mentioned to you. What that means is that economic systems require physical inputs, just like the dog, and they have material inputs of material and energy. And the more the economy grows, the more materials are consumed, and the more the environmental degradation occurs. The more pollution is generated that goes back into air, water, and soil. It cannot do anything else. But most economists, whether they're heterodox or orthodox, treat economies as physically isolated systems without any attention to these inputs and outputs. A physically isolated system means that there are no accounts taken of materials and energy. This is the standard macroeconomic diagram. This is the standard macroeconomic model, which still exists today in macroeconomics. It's the core. You will get it if you do macroeconomics 101, right? This is what you'll be taught. And what is it? Though it's a very limited model of reality. It's a model of reality which has just two entities, businesses and households, and two relationships between them, markets, two markets. We don't need to go into the details, but what we can recognize is that this macroeconomics is an isolated system. This is the growth economy. It can just continue going forever. It's a perpetual motion machine. There's nothing in here about it requiring inputs or outputs. There are no inputs. There are no outputs. The system is closed. It's actually isolated. What is that? It's a failure to address biophysical reality. It's a fundamental failure of the economics that we have. In the reality, we have this. This is the United States economy from 1900 to 2020 and the materials that it requires to maintain its growth economy. As you can see, they increase over time as growth goes on, and you have a massive amount of the basic construction aggregates going in, but also other things. Non-organic materials actually increasing over time, which is derivatives from oil, petroleum, plastics, and so on. And if you look at the recycling, it's minuscule in terms of the relationship. The other thing you can note here is the only time that the materials flow goes down is when there's a recession. So nothing that has been done to actually control the flow of material and energy through the system, which creates pollution, has had an impact. Only recessions have had an impact in terms of the turning down of the flows. We can also look at this. If I take out the stone, sand, and gravel, you get a bit of a better picture, and you can see what's been happening over time. You can see that the recycled metals, recycled paper is minuscule. So discussions of circular economy, which is pushed heavily by the European Union, is actually doing nothing. In terms of the major flows through the system, the flows are ongoing. And many of these things cannot be recycled in any case, right? And the other thing you can see here is if you look at the left-hand side of the diagram, you'll see that what constituted the economy was actually wood products, and it was an organic economy based around solar heavily. There are some resource inputs going into there from metals and so on, but it's largely an economy that is based on renewable resources, not non-renewables. As we move across time, it becomes less and less renewable. And this is even clearer. So how can you let such an economy be sustained? How can it continue growing? How can we continue this economy? So what I was just mentioning about the renewables, non-renewables is very clear in this diagram. So if we redraw the diagram and show the percentages of the different inputs into the economy, you can see that in the 1900s, the economy is heavily based on wood products. And there's agriculture at the very bottom. And then over time, that is diminished and becomes less and less important. So what you have is the United States economic system today is heavily dependent on non-renewable raw materials, right? By definition, non-renewables are not renewable. So what we say, oh, well, we can reform the economic system. The economic system is going to change. We've got technology. We're going to increase the durability of things. We've got innovation. All these problems can be solved, right? But that actually ignores another issue, which is the psychology, as I call it, the psychosocial aspects of the economy and consumption. What does that mean? It means this. Okay, look at how the lifetime of typical things like computers, printers, laptops, and so on, mobile phones, and so on. They have a limited lifetime, but that's not actually the issue. It's not increasing the durability of these products, which is the issue. It's this. They get thrown away. They get thrown away before they've even finished their lifetime. Because the system is about creating profits out of getting innovative things, getting you to buy the latest model of the latest phone. This smartphone is no longer any good. We need a smarter smartphone, or the old phones were stupid phones, or whatever. Things changing all the time. Fashion consciousness, destroy your product because your product is no longer fashionable. Get rid of it. This is a psychosocial state of the economy. It's not about durability. It's not about reducing waste. It's not about circular economies. It's about selling stuff and making money. That's what it's about. So, throwaway fashion-conscious society driven by growth and conspicuous consumption. What's conspicuous consumption? Goes back to the late 1800s and Veblen. It's like people showing off to others their status in society through their consumption, that they're consuming the right thing. They want to be in this group. They want to be the person with the biggest car, with the Hummer V, with the whatever. And the other side of this is that we have an effluent society. It's not just that this quantity is an issue or the security of supplies, it's what is being innovative. What does technology do? Just like the aerosol can for spraying your armpits depleted the ozone layer, we have a whole range of chemicals going back into the environment. What is the new smart green economy going to do? The new smart green economy is going to extract massive amounts of electrical waste, batteries, lithium, and it's going to dump it back into the environment because it's the same old system. It's not a different system. It's exactly the same system. Energy extraction, resource extraction, and dumping things back into the environment. That is the system. So, if we go to the basic laws of physics, we don't have to stop with the law of conservation of mass. We can also go beyond that. So, conservation of energy and mass. So they can neither be created nor destroyed. So the first law of thermodynamics, the internal energy of an isolated system is constant. That means the energy you use is going to go through the system and come out the other end. So inputs of both materials and energy into the economy must increase waste loads back into the environment. So pollution is not some minor aberration as economists talk about it. It's actually all-pervasive phenomena. All economic activities create pollution. Entropy, then, is the second law of thermodynamics. What is this? This is a measure of the qualitative usefulness of energy, so the qualitative state of energy. So while energy is constant in an isolated system, it moves from usefulness to minimum usefulness. So we burn a lump of coal, you can't get that back. It's gone. It was useful as coal, now it's not concentrated anymore, it's depleted. What we also do when we use these concentrated forms of energy and minerals is that we actually dissipate them, right? So we create disorder. We create order in our society by using low entropy resources, and then we create disorder elsewhere. We disperse materials and energy. So what are the Earth's systems that we can actually use? What is the Earth able to do? Planet Earth is not an isolated system. It's open because we have flows of energy from the solar, from the sun. And we have some other means of exchange, so the rotation of the planets, the gravitational forces. But we have a limited range of low entropy resources upon which we depend. So terrestrial stocks of concentrated minerals, solar flow of radiant energy, and gravitational force of moons and planets. But as we saw with the US economy, the move has been towards the terrestrial stocks of concentrated minerals, the non-renewables. So let's take that into account. Terrestrial stocks of concentrated minerals. What does that mean for the economic system? It means this. The United Kingdom, first country to industrialize, first country to become a capitalist economic system in a modern sense. And this economy, as you can see, is built on the idea of extraction of coal. Coal is the thing, the big switch. You extract massive amounts of coal. It's a fossil fuel economy. Then, by the time we get to the post-war era, stimulated by the technologies that were developed by the military for the war, you get a switch into petroleum. So then we get a coal and petroleum economy. Then we get natural gas, and that's it, right? So what is the economy? The economy is a fossil fuel economy. This is the only type of industrialized economic system that has ever existed. And all industrialized economies are growth economies based on fossil fuel energy. They are fossil fuel economies. By definition, this is what they are. Just look at the empirical evidence, right? So there is no other economic system that has ever existed, and that's the only one that we've had. And the result of this, if we go to the physics, is that this is not a big surprise, right? If you burn fossil fuels, you get emissions from fossil fuels. And those emissions include carbon dioxide. So the bigger your economy, the more it grows, the more carbon dioxide you get. So the idea that a decarbonized economy could exist would mean you'd be down here somewhere, right? Who's down here? Nobody is down here. There is no economy. The economies are not moving along here, increasing GDP without increasing emissions. The emissions are going up all the time. The bigger your economy, the more emissions you have. That's basically what happens. That's the economic growth system. And it's not surprising. It's a fossil fuel economy. It's a fossil fuel economic system. So when we get to climate change and we look at what's going on with the climate change issues, we're supposed to stay below 1.5 degrees. Well, this is showing you the reserves of fossil fuels at the top part here in the first bar. The second bar is the emissions. The emissions to date, shown in the past cumulative emissions on the left. Then you get to the orange, which is the emissions that are committed already because of infrastructure, airports, roads, energy systems. Those are already committed. So we're not changing our basic fossil fuel burning economies, so we're committed to that. Where does that take us to? With the committed infrastructure, we're already in 2 degrees C. So when we look at this, the 2 degrees C target is here, and this research says this is a 50-50 chance of getting 2 degrees. It's not certain, so there's uncertainty here. But also, we can update this. This is old, right? Let's update it from 2011, when this was published, actually, to last year, 2024. So if we take into account the cumulative emissions that have occurred since this paper was written, then we end up here. So we're already in the 2 degree zone and moving up. So what does that mean in terms of fossil fuels? Why is there a continual exploration for fossil fuels and bringing online non-conventional, or what's called here unconventional resources, which is oil, tar sands, and so on? This is unusable reserves at a 2 degree C target. We don't need any more fossil fuels if we're going to keep the planet from changing its chemistry so that we get climate change. So, raising the geopolitical question, it's no longer about the resources and securing the resource supplies. It's about who gets to use up the sinks. Who is going to end up using those carbon sinks? That is the geopolitical question. So, what happens in the geopolitics? The intergovernmental panels, they switched the agenda to talking about risk management for prevention, because they want to maintain the growth economy. So what you get is the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. In 1992 was discussing it as this: the ultimate objective of this convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gases, concentrations in the atmosphere at a level which would prevent dangerous anthropocentric interference with the climate system. Prevent. What happens by 2015? We get this discussion. This treaty, signed in Rio in 92, is a planetary risk management treaty. Oh, it's not about prevention anymore. It's about risk management. Its objective is not to prevent climate change. It's not going to prevent climate change. It's just going to manage the risks associated, and it's going to financialize them. That's what's happening now with climate catastrophe bonds and other financial risk management tools. So the UNFCCC has changed dramatically, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts. And we've already gone beyond that anyway. We're already in 2 degrees. So the environmental crisis, I've been talking a lot about climate change. It's become very dominant. It's become perniciously dominant because what is happening is everything else is being ignored, all the other problems of the system. The system is creating a whole range of environmental problems, right? And we could go on. There's a big list here. And all the problems that were there in the 50s and 60s are still with us. They haven't been solved, they have not gone away, and they are increasing with the economic growth system. So the deception then in economics, in mainstream economics, is that these things are conceptualized as externalities, right? And this has been used both by neoclassical economists and neoliberal economists to talk about solutions like Pigovian taxes and cozy property rights, so increasing private property rights or putting prices into the economy. They don't address the structure of the economic system, and they also pervert what some of the people like Pigu were actually saying about it. So economists regard pollution externalities as minor aberrations to an otherwise perfectly functioning market system. They regard markets as perfectly efficient systems, which they're clearly not. And they then say, oh, we can just put a price on something and that will adjust it and the problem will be solved. Because we've seen from the basic laws of physics, pollution is all pervasive. It doesn't go away. And this goes back again to the 1970s, right? What do they say? In the 1970s, the economists already recognized, in reality, they are a normal, indeed inevitable part of these processes. Their economic significance tends to increase as economic development proceeds, and the ability of natural environment to receive and assimilate them is an important natural resource of rapidly increasing value. Rapidly increasing value means that it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. That's what it means. Physical harm to people and the environment. Externalities then are not external to the economic system. Again, a mainstream conceptualization of a problem which perverts it and changes it into something which it is in reality not. It is not external to the economic system, it's a structural part of economic processes. The implications then for economic price theory are that there is no free market economy with efficient prices. It does not exist, and it never has existed, and it never will exist. Including social costs means you change all the prices in the economy. There's no simple efficiency claims to be made. What does that mean? It means that if I start calculating the cost of carbon and put it into the economy, every single price in the economy will change. Or why should I stop at carbon? Why shouldn't I put sulfur dioxide in it? Why shouldn't I put nitrous oxides in it? What about all those pollutants that I talked about? And who's going to calculate the costs? And who decides whether they are included or excluded? The system is planned. It's a planned system, and what's included and excluded is a decision made by authorities. So, prices are contextual and formed by power relations and institutional processes. The market economy is no less structured and planned than any planned economy ever was. Prices reflect the power and ability to realize cost shifting. What is the price? It's a negotiated power relationship between the powerful people. Who gets the subsidies? Who gets the price breaks? Who gets the trade agreements? Who gets the resources? Who gets whatever? For if economic units with unequal power are able to shift part of their costs to others, and moreover able to plan their sales and hence consumer demand through sales promotional activities, market costs and prices must be regarded as more or less arbitrary and indeed unreliable measures of economic rationality. So Cap wrote this back in the 60s. So we can talk about not externalities of pollution, but as Cap did, as cost-shifting exercises. Pollution is about who ends up getting the pollution dumped on them and who ends up paying the costs in terms of harms, real harms, not financial costs. So the pursuit of private gain places a premium on the minimization of private costs under current production, and the more this is emphasized, the greater the probability of social costs. What that means is the more you emphasize cost efficiency, the more you incentivize people shifting costs onto other people. So let's have a nice green European economy and dump all the pollutants on other people in the third world. Let's exploit the resources and have child labor in Southeast Asia so we don't have child labor in Czech Republic or in England or wherever. Shifting the costs to other people so you can have cheap clothes for your fashion throwaway industries. Social costs are irreducible to money. That's the other side of it. When we use the term cost, we don't mean just finances. We don't just mean money. So the fact that private entrepreneurs are able to shift part of the total costs of production to other persons or to the community as a whole points to one of the most important limitations of the scope of neoclassical value theory. As long as it continues to confine itself to market value, neoclassical economics will fail to assimilate to its reasoning and its conceptual system many of the costs and returns which cannot be expressed in dollars and cents. Dead people, that's what we're talking about. Flooding, catastrophe, fires burning people's homes down and killing them. You know, this is what's happening today. It's happening right now. Floods, fires, devastation, people dying. How much is a person worth? So, environmental economics versus ecological economics. What we've seen is that there's a development of environmental thinking that goes through, which I showed you at the beginning, from the neoclassical agricultural economics, resource economics, environmental economics. And then we get interactions with ecology, which is more diverse, so the ecologists start developing systems theory and bringing in their ideas about the flows of energy materials through systems. So we get ecology coming in. This ecology comes in, and we get to ecological economics. But ecological economics is also subject to a whole range of other ideas from social sciences, socialism, political theory, political ecology, moral philosophy, environmental ethics, institutional economics, social psychology. A whole range of different things coming in order for you to be able to understand what is an economic system and how does it operate. What that means is, I would say that here is actually a fundamental paradigmatic dividing line. We get a division between these understandings. And I would replace this now with social ecological economics, because ecological economics fail to take into account adequately the social and political relationships in a market system and its power relationships. So, orthodox mainstream approach to the environment, we can contrast this. So, what does the orthodox mainstream do when it's discussing the environment? Treats the environment as a special type of issue which fits into general theoretical constructs of the mainstream. It's a resource allocation problem, or it's an information issue problem. So it doesn't disturb the basic model. The focus then of the concepts, as we saw, the concepts are converted into things that fit with mainstream thinking. So you get a conversion of the characteristics of ecological, biological, and physical entities and their structures into economic concepts, externalities and missing markets, capital, natural capital. Ecosystems become services, ecosystem services. The green becomes green growth. Everything fits into the model. Markets, capital, services, growth. Where's the environment? Where's the ecology? Where's the ecosystem understanding? It's not there. So goals of increasing possibly adjusted GDP, universal wage labor, getting jobs, getting the prices right, advancing high technology. This is the entire policy approach then. And what does that mean? Economics then is defined as wealth creation within a liberal political philosophy. So it's heavily related to a political philosophy. Mainstream economists do not discuss this. They have a political philosophy. They have an ideological position. They are heavily ideologically embedded in liberal political positions, with an emphasis on private property rights and a negative definition of freedom. What is it to be free in this society? It's to be free from something, to be free from coercion, interference by others. That is what freedom is, especially government. So it's anti-government, even though it's heavily embedded in government structures and totally dependent upon them, because it requires a legal system and private property rights in order to run. So nature-society relationships, it sees nature as a resource to be exploited, which we can see going all the way up to the 1800s. It can be regarded as a capital asset, such as like the Dasgupta review recently regards the environment, and which means it has to give a rate of return. Why should we invest in preventing climate change unless we get a good rate of return on investment? So sources of utility satisfaction for the individual, so it's very much individualistically based, and it's still based around utilitarianism fundamentally. The social ecological economic approach then is very different. So what you recognize here is you have to pay serious attention to environmental reality, which leads us to a new approach in political economy and interdisciplinary learning. We have to learn from the other disciplines, from the natural sciences. Focus on realist social concepts and realist ecological dependencies. So we talk about cost shifting, non-market institutions, class conflict, political and economic power, what's called the imperial mode of living by Uli Brand, who's a political scientist. Social metabolism, what is the metabolism going through the society, through the economic system? Unequal exchange, how is exchange operating, colonialism, imperialism, and so on, creating unequal exchange? Ecosystem structure and function, not services, not capital. How do ecosystems function, and what's their structure? And the goal here is of a good and meaningful life, which means sufficiency, meeting needs, a just and ethical society, and appropriate technology, not just high technology that makes profit for corporations. Economics, then, is redefined. What is economics about? Economics is a social provisioning within a communitarian and inclusive participatory political philosophy. We live in a society. We are humans. We are not individuals. We are inherently social beings, and we depend on others for our economic system to operate. So, an emphasis on common rights, sharing and care, and a positive definition of freedom, not the negative definition of freedom that we saw, a positive definition of freedom as being free to achieve something, free to achieve a type of life that you would want, a good life. Nature-society relationships, then nature is regarded as the other. Nature is not human. There is human have natural elements, but it's a dialectic. So we can talk about naturalness. So we're aware that some things are unnatural, artifacts. We get into issues about plural values, not a monistic value. Incommensurability, not everything can be reduced down. You can't reduce the value of a human life to amount of money, for example. Intrinsic values, taking non-humans into account as morally considerable. So a very different approach to economics. And economics and ecological reality, what do we mean by this, right? So there's all sorts of implications for economics of taking ecology seriously, dynamic implications. We are constantly changing the environment by introducing different pollutants into the environment, changing the way that we extract resources and what we depend on in terms of energy. So we create energy flows, material flows, and we create disorganization with our approaches to economic systems. There's irreparable damage. Things are being destroyed. Species are dying. There's a massive extinction of species going on right now. So this is not reversible. So we have irreparable damage. This is not taken into account in terms of mainstream concepts. Ecology will also make us emphasize the non-scarcity issues, right? Sources and sink functions have been erroneously assumed to be things that we can just either take for free, or that these are not scarce, that they're going to be there. Clearly, this is not the case. We're running out of the ability to continue using the upper atmosphere as a dump for our greenhouse gases. Qualitative degradation. So it's not just about the quantity, it's not just about the scale of the economy, which is something that people like Herman Daly as an ecological economist emphasize. It's also about the qualities of what's going on. You can threaten ecological stability by putting the wrong substance into it. DDT into a human is not good, right? It doesn't matter, the quantity is not the issue, it's how toxic it is and what interactions it has. Surprise and novel events can happen, like spraying your armpits with CFCs and ending up destroying the upper atmosphere. So qualitative degradation. And we have ignorance, right? Which would emphasize precaution and preventing things happening, but instead what we have is risk and risk management. So ignorance of potential feedbacks from the economic system into the ecosystems. So basically, there's a whole range of things, if you take ecology seriously, would actually change the way that you would have public policy on the environment and how you would run your economic system. The scale of the economy is important. If you keep growing the scale of the economy, you're going to keep putting materials through it and back into the environment, but also the qualities of what is produced. Innovation, smart economies will change the substances going back into the environment, and we have unintended consequences as a result. So what we have in a basic understanding of social ecology economics is the structure of the economic system. We can start to think about it in realist terms. There is a physical realm, a material reality on which everything is based. We have to obey the laws of physics. That's the material reality. There's a biological realm. We, as entities, as biological entities, have to obey the basic biological laws. Then when we get to the humans, us, the imaginative beings, we're emergent from those other realms. We are subject to what they require, to their structures. So when we get to the social realm, which is emergent from us as humans, we get to economics. So economics can be understood as co-emergent with the social realm. And the economics, as I'm arguing, is a realm of institutions for social provisioning. Institutions which are designed by humans and put in place, which are planned. So we have institutions for social provisioning. And what is capitalism? Capitalism is just one small form of economic system. Capitalist economies are not even uniform. They're of different types, with different regulations, with different arrangements between different institutions. So we have a variety of potential systems, but we have a variety of systems in actuality. Many people do not live in capitalist economies, they live in alternatives, and they are opposing them because of the kind of impacts they have on the environment and on other people. So what you have here is an ontological relationship, an understanding of reality, which is about concepts of emergence and dependence, how we emerge from the physical and the biological, and our dependencies on them. So if we place capitalism and the market economy in context, we try to understand what it is, we can think capitalism is a specific class of different types of economy. It's not uniform. It's a range of different types of economies with different arrangements. Markets as mechanisms, so when people talk about the market, there is no such thing as the market. There are different types of market institutions. They're mechanisms for allocation, and they are just one form of social provisioning arrangements. And there are many others, and there's a diverse range of them. So talk of the economy, which is very common, is highly misleading, as if there were only one economic system. And when people talk about that, they mean market capitalism. And there is no such thing as one form of market capitalism. So they're denying both the actuality, what is there in reality that is actualized today, and also the potentiality for alternative economic systems, that we don't have to live in this particular system that we happen to have right now. So social provisioning directs you to think about society and economy and the mutual interdependence between those different systems, and regarding them both as socially emergent, so simultaneously emergent, the society and the economy come together. So if you understand the economy as a social provisioning system, you always have social provisioning whenever you have a society, a social grouping. So an economy is a social provisioning system. All human societies have provisioning systems by definition, and all economies have social, cultural, structural dependency. Social provisioning then, as Fred Lee, a heterodox economist, said, he said, human agency can take place only in an interdependent social context, which emphasizes the social and de-emphasizes the isolated nature of individual decision-making. And the organization of social provisioning is determined outside of markets. It's a social arrangement, an institution. Although the provisioning process itself will, in part, take place through capitalist markets. Now, what Fred Lee is there saying is that in the Western society, in our developed economies, we have the market structures already there. Therefore, he's expecting you would continue that institution. But there's no reason why you should continue that institution as understood as a capitalist market. There are many forms of markets that we can design and that have existed in history. So whether and to what extent capitalist markets should be part of an economy is a process, right? It's in the process of achieving social provisioning we can open the question up on that and say why. What is the role of this particular form of market, this institution? How should it be designed, and what are its conditions for operation? Economic analysis then concerns the variety of institutions for ensuring the satisfaction of needs and the reproduction of a society. What institutions do we put in place to make sure our social provisioning systems operate and meet people's needs? So identifying a range of fundamental requirements for ethically good and meaningful lives, needs and satisfiers, and social minima, as has been discussed in the literature. So society and economy. Economics has become very much focused on individuals, the individual encapsulated in a political liberalism and methodological individualism. So there's a political philosophy here implicit in the whole approach. And what's missing from the individualistic account is the need for considering society, for considering how do we actually maintain a caring community and look after the environment. It was very evident in the pandemic that a care society is an essential aspect of human society, right? And it's not taken into account. So establishing the institutions of a caring society that recognize the quality of social relationships and interdependencies as constitutive of a good society. Individuals living on their own, isolated, is not a good society. So modern market economies misdirect the meaning and care via objectifying societal and nature relationships as commodities and reducing value to monetary exchange. What that means is that you commodify social relationships. You have to make money out of it. You have social media. You have means of selling something to somebody. It's not about caring. It's not about sympathy for others. It's not about social relationships. It's about making money and individualizing people to sell them products. So we want values beyond individual preferences and relationships to others. And the others, I include non-humans here, the relationship to the non-human. So what are we doing then? We're going back to a political economy. I'd say we're going back actually into the 1800s in one sense, in understanding what is economics and economic science. It is political economy. As John Stuart Mill said, in 1874, political economy is not as a thing by itself, but as a fragment of the greater whole, a branch of social philosophy, so interlinked with all other branches that its conclusions, even in its own particular province, are only true conditionally, subject to interference and counteraction from causes not directly within its scope, while to the character of a practical guide it has no pretensions apart from other classes of consideration. So what he's saying is, if you have economics as a narrowly defined discipline, it gives you no policy advice at all because it's irrelevant to the system you're talking about. You have to take other things into account. You have to be able to take into account the other understandings about the policy problem you're trying to address. So economics then becomes interdisciplinary. Economics is an interdisciplinary social science that connects with the natural sciences in order to understand the basic requirements for social provisioning and the reproduction and the structure of alternative caring ethical societies. So what we end up with is a critical social science is necessary for us to remain questioning as to the concepts and their relationships, a means of avoiding dogmatism and the economic imperialism evident in the current mainstream orthodoxy. So social ecological economics, I just throw this up. The slides will be available later, but I show you the whole range of different things that are coming on board. We have physical reality, we have thermodynamics, we have the basic laws of physics, we have biological concepts, we have dependencies on the biological, sustainability, resilience, co-evolution development, a whole range of things, ecosystems, how they're structured and function, and how they operate, and their emergent properties. We don't have just individuals, we have individuals and society, so we're embedded in societies, which means we have to open up the box and start talking about agency versus structure. What are you able to do as an agent? What structure do you live in? Psychosocial practices, like I mentioned with consumption, care and community, social reproduction, ideas of needs and satisfies, all of these issues come on board. Environmental values, not reducing value just down to monistic monetary measures, starting to take into account how we design institutions to allow people to articulate the values they hold. Incommensurability, that not everything can be reduced down to a single measure. Recognizing there are alternative types of ethical systems, not just utilitarianism, but also rights-based thinking, virtue ethics, and so on, and value pluralism. The science policy interface, when we get to things like climate change, pollution problems, and so on, recognizing that not everything can be reduced down to probabilities and weak uncertainty, that we have ignorance, that we do not know everything about the system, and we do not know where it's going, but that does not mean we cannot act. It means that we act in a different way with precaution. Moving on to going past normal science, discussing ideas of critical realism. And institutions and power, recognizing that the institutions are, in the society, structured by us as humans. There are conventions, norms, rules, and regulations in every single economy, every single social system. We can discuss issues about democracy, participation, and deliberation, and what does that mean, and how should those be structured? But we can also discuss the role of the powerful institutions in society, the state, corporations, unions, NGOs. And we should also take into account the military-industrial complex. So this is a whole range of issues which we can bring in for our understanding. And I just put this up, so this is taken from my recent book as well, to understand the divisions between orthodox mainstream economics and heterodox economics. So on the left-hand side, you have a radical nonconformity to the orthodoxy. And what you have in the middle is people who think that they can borrow ideas from the mainstream and that this will reform it. So orthodox dissenters, were called heretics, they quite often get the Nobel Prize in economics because they don't change anything. They raise a little problem and then they go back into the mainstream with their ideas. So we have a fundamental difference between these two. This is a different paradigm. It's a paradigmatically different approach to economics in the heterodoxy, and there are common understandings here. So, conclusions. A few summary key points. Okay, so growth is based on low entropy resources and resource exploitation. Modern industrial society requires low entropy mineral and fossil fuel energy sources. That means extraction of resources is an essential part of the growth economy. Externalities are not external. Their material and energy use creates pollution and disrupts ecosystems' functions, impacts human health and non-human animals. and it's an essential part of the material throughput, material energy throughput of an economic system. And if it grows, it creates more and more problems. Technology introduces a range of new substances, materials into the environment, and it has unpredictable social and environmental consequences. So I've discussed the environmental consequences, but there are social consequences. You have all grown up with mobile phones. Your behavior is fundamentally different than your parents'. Faith remains in a utopian vision, right? The idea of the growth economy is a utopia. It's not discussed as that. It's not a reality. It's not pragmatic. It's utopia. An ever-expanding happiness which turns human into pleasure-seeking hedonists. How happy can you be? Just get happier and happier all the time. Well, you must just take some drugs, right? We need an alternative utopian vision. Gross social inequity and stability are not addressed by growth. Growth does not create equity. It does not create stability. It creates instability. And it does not create equity. It creates extraction of resources from the poorest to keep the rich countries going. This continues to rely on exploitation of people and resources in a rhetoric of globalization and competition. Real competition, as should be very evident to everybody today, is backed by military might. Macroeconomics does not address power or politics, but supports both the military-industrial complex and technologically driven leadership race. So the structure of development is growth. What is the growth economy, the basic structure about? Massive fossil fuel combustion, resource extraction, and pollution. This involves land grabbing, both domestic and foreign, control of resources and resource supplies and supply chains, which means militarization and imperialism. There is forced urban migration, which is on a massive scale in all sorts of countries. Creation of an urban underclass as a result, the people shifting out of sustainable agricultural systems into unsustainable urban living. Denigration of traditional lifestyles and culture, deconstruction of the rural and indigenous and First Nations communities, dependency on unpaid female labor, all of these aspects are how the system operates. Establishment of a minority rich elite and a new middle class. The system maintains itself by giving feedback to some people, making some people better off, while extracting rents and so on from the others, and cost shifting onto others. So social ecological economics, then, is a call for a radically different economics. Reconnecting to long-standing positions about essential biophysical foundations of an economic system. In philosophical terms, adopting a critical realist approach that seeks causal explanation of biophysical and social structure. I haven't said so much about that. Realism I've mentioned. Criticality is essential to prevent dogmatism, being able to think all the time and question. Revitalizing human nature relationships and values, so rejecting the treatment of nature and non-humans as resources for exploitation and valued as a preference. So as we've seen, this is a long-standing position in economics. Explicitly addressing a range of neglected and dismissed issues in economics, ethics and value, institutions, to understand that all economic systems are institutions, institutions as conventions, norms and enforced rules and regulations, that there are power and internal relationships, that we have to address power, and that the actual reproduction of society goes on through a whole range of practices today, unpaid female labor and cost shifting. So regarding economics as political economy with explicit values aiming to create better and more socially just, environmentally ethical, and economically equitable social provisioning systems. Thank you.
Thank you for a very extensive, representative, and for me almost overwhelming presentation of all these problems. And now we have time for discussion. First, just an organizational question. Has everybody signed all the attendance sheets, all the 2 attendance sheets? Oh, so please make sure you all sign them. And now it's time for questions. So please. Is there a microphone? Is there a microphone which people can...
Just taking it away.
Okay, so you'll just have to rephrase the question.
Ano? Nej? Ano? Jo, tak jo, tak já budu běhat. Dobře.
Good.
Thank you very much for the lecture. It was a pleasure to hear all this. Well, pleasure, kind of depressive, perverse pleasure. You spoke of the revolution that never was in environmental economics, and I do wonder how exactly it happened that this revolution either failed or perhaps it was a revolution betrayed. And because the climate, as you yourself have shown, was very favorable to these ideas in the 60s and 70s, ideas that have since basically fallen into oblivion. And there were the student revolts and the oil shock of 73, and Limits to Growth was bought by millions and millions of copies. It really seemed at the time that a revolution in thinking was about to happen. Sico Mansholt, who became the president of the European Commission, was very favorable to these ideas in 72. And then suddenly, all of this thinking is replaced by some kind of primitive neoliberalism, which, as Chomsky said, was neither new nor liberal. How did that happen?
Yeah. So I think what happens in the 60s and 70s is there are fundamental changes in public policy. So we shouldn't underestimate what it was achieved. So you do get things like environmental protection agencies are established internationally. All nations start having them. There is legislation comes in. There is legislation about Clean Air Acts to protect the urban environment. There are bans on burning coal and things like this. So there's regulation that comes on. There is a lot of stuff that happens. But the result of this, and the result of the late 60s, early 70s, is that there's a pushback, a massive pushback. So you get the corporations and the businesses start to get frightened. They get worried they're losing power, which they are losing power, right? So what happens is that over the next 10 years, you get a pushback, which occurs, and they become organized. So in the 1970s and 80s, they start hiring public relations firms. So you can look at what the corporations do. They hire a public relations firm, and what do the public relations firms tell them to do? They say, don't oppose the people, agree with them, bring them on board, co-opt them, take over environmental NGOs, put your people on the boards of the environmental NGOs, Worldwide Fund for Nature, Nature Conservancy, put financiers and corporate executives and your friends on the boards, and then make the environment an issue that is something you're concerned about. We're very concerned about the environment. We should have financial mechanisms to help, commodities that can help, get markets operating to play to you and give you an advantage. That's what's been happening. Get a seat at the table. Don't let the negotiations at the IPCC and Paris go on without there being a ton of corporate executives, financiers, and bankers sitting at the table to determine the policy instruments. It's a strategy. It's a long-term strategy, and it's played off. They've succeeded. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't a failure. But what happened with the economics is also a specific academic kind of aspect. The failure there is, as I'm talking about with the failure of the revolution of the environmental economists, is that people conform. So what do you do if you're in an economics department, a mainstream economics department, and you start raising issues about the environment, and everybody else is talking about growth, unemployment, and inflation? And they tell you, oh, you should be publishing in the American Economic Review or the Economic Journal or Econometrica. Otherwise, you won't keep tenure for your job. You won't get promotion. So there's a structure there that is already in place. And then when there's a heterodox structure, these departments are attacked. The individuals are attacked. People are pushed out. So what you see is like Marxist economics is shut down. Manchester School of Marxism economics was shut down effectively. Done via research assessment exercises, done through saying these people are not publishing in the right journals and so on and so forth. Well, they don't bring in research grants. So there's a whole range of mechanisms that are brought in which are controlling the economics. So people move to geography. I was in the geography department, right, after economics. You move out, you move to other departments. People moved into management. I'm in a business school, right? You know, think about it. It's kind of...
Next question.
Nice afternoon. I would like to ask you if you see any potential paradigm shift in economics from the perspective of behavior economics.
From behavioral economics.
Yeah, because I see some interconnections with the social aspect of social economics.
So what I would say is behavioral economics ends up being pretty much actually in my middle phase here. So behavioral economics has been captured a lot of the time, and it ends up being this middle section of orthodox dissenters. A lot of behavioral economics is not disturbing the fundamental territory. So it brings in anomalies, it brings in variations, but a lot of it is still around individual behavior, a focus on the individual, and not questioning the basic structures of society or getting to the structural issues. So while it brings lots of things in, like many of these variations in economics today, I would say what it is a sign of is a desperate attempt to create a periphery around the core. So you have the core of economic ideas does not change. And what you have is all this discussion that goes on where they say, oh, no, we're very diverse, we're bringing in all these ideas, look what we do, just like they do with environmental economics. Oh, we're very concerned about the environment and so on. But the concepts have to conform to the core. So they don't fundamentally change things. So you have lots of diversity, and you have an amazing amount of conflict and confusion because it's actually contradictory to the core, lots of what goes on. But it never has an impact because the core remains unchanged. So it's like a defensive mechanism, effectively. Lots of discussion in economics all over the place. And if you look at it, it would mean that it's incoherent and it's actually got real problems if you were to take the behavioral economics seriously. But it's not taken seriously. It's just a specialization where people discuss a bunch of stuff, so what? The environmental economists have been doing it for 50 years, never had an impact on anybody. Same kind of issue, I think.
Okay. Next question, please. Well, okay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. My colleagues already said that, but it was really amazing. And I wanted to ask, you said that the growth economics is really dependent on female unpaid labor. And in the sort of theory of Nancy Fraser, I feel like effective care is basically becoming like a fourth type of capital. And I wanted to ask if you have any thoughts of where do we find ourselves in the feminist movements, because it feels like either women have the choice to either perform the care for free and therefore just enable the system, or just give up and, I don't know, pay someone to do the care, which also doesn't feel right?
Yeah. So I think one of the issues there is that it's also to talk about the structure of the economic system we're in and to differentiate between what you would like to have, a care economy, which is basically very different than the current system, and working within the system, recognizing that there is unpaid care work. So the feminists that I know will argue against the kind of ideas of liberal feminism, which is to put everything into the marketplace, which is basically like the environmental economists put a price on everything. And this does not help. It just makes everything into a market commodity. And we don't want to commodify care. That's the problem. So care is being commodified today, very massively so, right? So care homes run by corporations and this kind of stuff. So that's the market kind of stuff. At the same time, you therefore need a care economy, so you need institutions that talk about care, but we have to move away from the market system then, away from the way in which the market is operating. But also, people will also discuss the patriarchal society. So if we're living in patriarchy, then the institutions that are brought in reproduce the patriarchy, right? So male, female relationships, what is it to be male, what is it to be female, what roles do you perform in society? And this is what I mean by institutions, right? So changing the institutions is about changing the norms in society and also the rules and regulations, but also the conventions. So what is it to actually care for somebody, and why should it be done only by female labor? But also there's a fundamental issue of the importance of care work, which is undervalued. So what you have is the mentality that care doesn't matter, which we clearly saw was bullshit, right? I mean, look what happened with the pandemic. There was nothing more important than care. But now it's forgotten again. So, in the UK, they were clapping the care workers. Oh, thank you. And now they stopped clapping, So there's more, I think, about the structure of the institutions and society. So, ecofeminists want to reform the structure of society. You have to get to the structure. And that's the thing that you're trapped in. And if we don't address the structure, nothing will change.
Thank you.
Next question, please. Over there.
Thank you for the lecture. I wanted to ask maybe it's like a more personal question, because I'm sure that in the ecological economics, it's very diverse, the answer to this question. But if you would try to restructuralize the system, what are the institutions that should be responsible for the restructuralization, and then for the government of the new economic system, if you could describe it?
Yeah. So I think you have to be more contextual about which system you're in, right? So I've already pointed out there's lots of diversity. So there are systems, for example, in Mexico, there's whole communities who are outside of the system already who would be restructured in different ways, right? So the way they're operating. If we take, if I take the United Kingdom versus the United States versus Czech, each of those economies is going to have different institutions in place and different hang-ups about alternative institutions. Clearly, in Czech since 1989, there's a lot of aversion to talking about planning or doing anything that might strike us as communism. But this is a fallacy, right? As I've pointed out, all the systems are planned, and community is essential to every single economic system. So you've got hang-ups like that. If you're dealing with a state which is basically a neo-fascist United States today, with massive corporations, you have a different set of institutional problems. How do you reform the United States? Well, maybe democracy would be a good start, But you've got to look at the context in which you're working, I would say. And the other thing is that we're dealing with multiple levels of governance. So where do you act to change things? So we're dealing with, you can act at the local level, you can act at the family level, you can act with your friends, you can act at the regional level, you can act at the European level, you can act internationally. There's all sorts of different levels that you can operate at, and different institutions as a result that need to have reform. So it's not about, generic, I'm afraid, generalizations. We can talk generally about institutions, but I would also, as a critical realist, talk about the mechanisms, and then I want to look at the context in which I have to operate. If I'm operating in China, it's going to be very different than operating in the European Union, and the institutional reforms that I would require to get things through, or the United States today, again, another context. Yeah.
Okay, next question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your insights. And I'd be curious, what would be the approach of social ecological economics, or your approach to the questions of money and the monetary system, and perhaps kind of the institutional layers and ways of governing? Because it seemed to me that it is a topic that's not very often mentioned in classical and even in perhaps, some heterodox economics.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so money is obviously clearly, I mean, I think we go back to Marx, actually. So Marx is the really person who, I think, summarized the role of money in capitalism the best and inspired Keynes and Keynesian economics as a result. So Keynes has a big debt to Marxist theory about the money commodity form and the cycling of that through the economic system. I would say that I haven't worked heavily in this area, but I would think that we should go away from general purpose money, probably. This is one of the issues. And I think that people like Alf Hornberg, who works on social metabolisms and unequal exchange, is arguing in this direction. So you move towards local currencies and specialized monies. And this breaks the economic system, which is currently operating on a global trade level, creating unequal exchange. And it makes a much stronger connection to the regional ecology and the resources. So I think that's a worthwhile direction to look into. And I think it would also then strongly connect us to the ecological economics. But there is a lack of monetary theory in ecological economics, and it tends, unfortunately, I would say, to jump onto the Keynesian, post-Keynesian bandwagon with little thinking about that, because unfortunately the post-Keynesians are growth-oriented, heavily growth-oriented, and they do not take account of the environment. And despite my attempts to engage very heavily with them, and I have a book with them, it has not been a success in terms of getting them to understand the ecological and biophysical dependencies of the economic system and take it seriously and to take it on board. So there's work to be done there, but there's also policy directions developing, I would say.
Okay, next question. Before somebody thinks of a question, I have a question myself.
Okay.
You mentioned that actually all economies are planned, not only the old socialist economies. And obviously there's the issue of power here also concerned. Could you speak a little bit more about how these free trade economies are really planned?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest issues, if you look at economics, it ignores the real structure of the economic system. The biggest institution we have in the economy today, which is not discussed, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is the corporation, the multinational corporation. So where do people like Trump get their money from? Where do the people who are at the top of the system get their money from? From multinational corporations. The structure of those corporations is not discussed, how they get power, how they operate, and their interdependencies with government. Right? The Tesla car is a government product, heavily subsidized and funded by the government. And then they talk about free markets. There is no free market. What you have is power relationships, infiltration into a power system, and you take it over and you get the government to do things for you. And the government supplies the infrastructure. Where would cars be without roads? And who builds the roads? You do, because you pay for it through public taxes, and that supports the government that builds the roads, not private enterprise. So there's a massive, and there always has been, a massive investment from government in infrastructure to facilitate a capitalist economy, a market economy. And without that planning and infrastructure, there is no market economy. And this is not taken into account. So then you get this massive investment by government in the private entrepreneurs who then extract massive amounts of money into their own pockets in order to maintain the government's funding them for the future and keeping the structure going. So this is what's not looked at, I think, is that the power relationships between, especially the corporations and the way the corporations are operating. But what do then? They change the law. So in the United States, you can look at 100 years of the way the law has been changed to make the corporation into an individual that has legal standing as an individual. And it's an institution, like it's not an individual at all, but it's taken the legal legislation and taken it over. So there's a very good film made by Canadian film producers called The Corporation, which I say you should look at, which is very good at way of understanding how the corporation came about and the power structure and the powers it has. But it is the most powerful institution in our society today outside the nation state. And you can rank by revenue, you could rank the nation states and the corporations and you take the top 100 ones, and you rank them by their revenues, and you'll find in the top 50 there's 25 corporations. Banks, oil companies, corporations, and so on. So they are bigger than countries. And those corporations, how are they run? Through a democracy? Through a free market internal system? No. They're dictatorships. Those corporations are run by men in small groups commanding those production systems. They're planned, centrally planned in the worst and undemocratic way. Just look at the people at the top.
Yes, thank you. I thought so. We could also add the problem of lobbying at EU level, right, by corporations. That would be another issue.
Yeah. But lobbying, I said, the lobbying has also became a strategy of the corporations into the IPCC, into the intergovernmental bodies. And there's a massive lobbying. If you can actually document the change in lobbying, for example, in the European community, how many lobbyists there are relative to MPs. And it's an exponential growth in the lobbyists. So it's a strategy they have to overwhelm the political process with lobbying.
There are attempts on the side of the EU to limit this in some way, but not very effectual so far.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, maybe the last question?
Thank you. I wanted to ask if the revolution that never happened failed, and now the situation is that the corporations are maybe stronger than they were before, and the playing field is maybe even harder for social ecology. Why and how should it succeed nowadays, or it's just a graceful losing battle to be on the right side of the history?
Yeah, so the thing is that the problems are getting more and more in your face. When I started out as an environmental economist 40 years ago, and I used to tell people, they say, what are you studying? I said, environment and economics. People just walk away. Oh, that's weird. How can you do that? How can you bind the economy with environmental? It doesn't make any sense. People don't have that reaction today. It's obvious that the economic system is interacting with the environment. So the consciousness is way higher. Climate change, whether you're for it, against it, denialist, or whatever, is a public policy issue, and everybody knows it. Right? When I was working, you talk about acid rain or sulfur dioxide pollution, people didn't understand a thing about it. It wasn't an issue. They weren't paying attention. Now, the impacts are there, things are happening, right? It's on the ground, there's a division in society. So because the system hasn't changed, the divisions are getting bigger. The impacts are getting larger, and they're becoming more direct. Forest fires, flooding, devastation, and they cannot continuously try to push it away and say it's not happening. People are aware of it. The farmers know it's happening. The people who are suffering know it's happening. The people who are losing their land and so on. So there's a constituency, but there's a division. So what's happening? The system is reacting by securitization, increasing militarization, increasing the police forces, increasing surveillance. They're marginalizing the environmental movement. They're making them into terrorists. They're restricting civil rights and so on. So that's what's going on. So there's also a fight back. But there's also a much greater awareness that this is happening. So you've got to look at the mechanisms that are operative right now and look for the ones that you can use. What happened in the 1970s, when I say the revolution that never happened, it was the revolution in economics. Like I said, there were revolutionary changes. I mean, setting up an environmental protection agency and having ministers of the environment sitting at the cabinet level, that's a revolution of sorts, right? But of course, if people get captured, if the system doesn't respond and then there's a response, then you get counter mechanisms. So it's an ongoing power struggle in society. But I would say there's more hope today, actually, because there's this audience. There are these people sitting in this room listening and appreciating what I'm saying and understanding it. That's a big difference from 40 years ago.
Okay, thank you. That was a hopeful final. Thank you. Because of time constraints, I think we must finish now. I have Clive's latest book, if anybody wants to have a look at it later, and I think he deserves another round of applause.